The starship Eos, a battered relic of humanity's golden age of exploration, shuddered violently as its engines failed. Captain Leora Vance gripped the controls with white-knuckled hands, her dark hair plastered to her forehead by sweat. Warning alarms blared in the cockpit, their shrill tones echoing through the cramped space. Sparks flew from overloaded panels, and the acrid smell of burning circuits filled the air. "Come on, don't give out now," Leora muttered under her breath, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. She had been flying solo for years, navigating treacherous asteroid fields and uncharted nebulae. But this was different. Something massive had struck the ship moments ago, tearing through its hull like paper. Whatever it wasn't natural. With one last desperate maneuver, Leora angled the ship toward a nearby planet glowing faintly in the distance. It wasn't part of any known star chart, but it was her only chance. As the Eos entered the atmosphere, fiery streaks of red and orange engulfed the viewport. The ship groaned under the strain, metal screeching as if protesting its inevitable demise. When the impact came, it was brutal. Leora's body jerked forward, saved from slamming into the console only by her safety harness. For a moment, everything went black. When she opened her eyes again, the silence was deafening. Smoke curled lazily through the cabin, and the soft hum of the ship's systems had fallen silent. Coughing, Leora unbuckled herself and stumbled out of the wreckage. The alien landscape that greeted her took her breath away. Towering trees made of translucent crystal stretched high into the sky, their branches glowing faintly with an inner light. Strange plants pulsed rhythmically, as though breathing, and the ground beneath her boots shimmered like liquid glass. Above, two suns hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the terrain. But it wasn't just the beauty that caught her attention. It was the creatures watching her. Small, insect-like beings with iridescent wings hovered nearby, their multifaceted eyes fixed on her every move. Larger shapes moved in the distance, silhouetted against the twilight. Something about this place felt alive, not just the plants or animals, but the very air itself. Leora reached for her sidearm instinctively, then hesitated. These weren't hostile beings, at least not yet. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Her gaze darted upward when a deep rumble shook the ground. A shadow passed over her, blotting out the twin suns. Looking up, she froze. A dragon unlike anything she'd ever imagined soared overhead. Its scales shimmered with colors that seemed to shift depending on how the light hit them, and its wingspan was so vast it blocked out half the sky. On its back sat a figure clad in armor that gleamed like polished silver. Even from this distance, Leora could feel the intensity of the rider's glare. She swallowed hard, realizing she might have landed smack in the middle of someone else's territory. But before panic could fully set in, the dragon let out a deafening roar and banked sharply, disappearing behind a ridge of floating mountains. Leora exhaled slowly, clutching her weapon tighter. "Great," she whispered to herself. "Just what I needed. A welcoming committee." Little did she know, the rider atop the dragon was none other than Princess Calith, ruler of this mysterious world. And while Calith had seen many intruders come and go, none had ever survived long enough to earn her curiosity. Until now. Leora's heart pounded as she scanned the horizon, her fingers tightening around the grip of her sidearm. The dragon's roar still echoed in her ears, a sound so primal it sent shivers down her spine. She knew she couldn't stay near the wreckage. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. But where could she go? Every direction seemed equally alien and dangerous. Taking a deep breath, Leora decided to move toward the glowing forest. The crystalline trees might offer some cover, and if nothing else, they'd give her a chance to think. As she stepped cautiously into the shimmering undergrowth, the air grew cooler, tinged with an earthy scent that reminded her faintly of home. Above, the insect-like creatures flitted between branches, their wings casting tiny rainbows onto the ground. She hadn't gone far when another rumble shook the earth. This time, it wasn't distant. Turning sharply, Leora saw the dragon descending from the sky like a living storm. Its massive wings stirred up winds strong enough to bend even the towering crystal trees. On its back, the armored figure raised a spear, pointing it directly at her. "Not good," Leora muttered, backing away slowly. Her mind raced. Running wouldn't help. She'd never outrun something like that. Fighting was out of the question. One swipe of those claws would end her instantly. That left only one option. Try to talk her way out of this mess. The dragon landed with a thunderous impact, sending shockwaves through the ground. Leora stumbled but caught herself, keeping her weapon lowered. She locked eyes with the rider, who dismounted gracefully despite the heavy armor. Up close, the figure was unmistakably female, her sharp features framed by long, silver-streaked hair. Her piercing gaze bore into Leora, assessing her every move. "Who are you?" the woman demanded, her voice cold and commanding. "Why have you come here?" Leora swallowed hard. "I'm not here by choice," she replied, forcing herself to sound calm. "My ship malfunctioned. I didn't mean to trespass." The woman narrowed her eyes. "You expect me to believe that? Your kind always brings destruction wherever it goes." "My kind?" Leora frowned. "Look, I don't even know where here is. I just want to fix my ship and leave." Before the woman could respond, the dragon let out a low growl, stepping closer, its golden eyes fixed on Leora, unblinking. Most people would have bolted or collapsed in fear, but Leora stood her ground. Something about the creature intrigued her, its presence both terrifying and oddly mesmerizing. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Leora took a step forward instead of retreating. She spoke softly, her tone steady. "Easy there, big guy. I'm not going to hurt you." The dragon tilted its head slightly, almost as if considering her words. Even the armored woman looked taken aback, though she quickly masked her reaction with a scowl. "What is your name, intruder?" she asked after a moment. "Leora Vance," came the reply. "And yours?" "I am Princess Calith," the woman said, her voice laced with authority, "ruler of Zrinthia. And this," she gestured to the dragon, "is Vrakshin, my companion." Leora nodded slowly, trying to process everything. A princess, a dragon. None of this made sense, but arguing wouldn't help. Instead, she focused on the immediate problem: survival. "Listen, princess," Leora began carefully. "I don't want trouble. I'll leave as soon as I can repair my ship. Until then, maybe we can call a truce." Calith studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she gave a curt nod. "Very well. But make no mistake, if you betray my trust, Vrakshin will ensure you regret it." With that, Calith signaled for Leora to follow. As they walked, Leora couldn't help glancing at Vrakshin, whose massive form loomed over them. There was something extraordinary about him, not just his size or beauty, but the way he seemed to radiate intelligence. Whatever this world was, it defied all logic. And yet, as strange as it felt, Leora found herself oddly hopeful. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to survive here, and perhaps even thrive. The journey to Calith's palace was unlike anything Leora had ever experienced. The floating mountains loomed above them, their jagged peaks glowing faintly in the twilight. Suspended bridges made of shimmering, translucent material connected the structures carved into the cliff sides, creating a surreal landscape that looked like it belonged in a dream or a nightmare. Armed guards flanked them on all sides, their weapons gleaming ominously as they escorted Leora deeper into Zrinthian territory. Despite her situation, Leora couldn't help but marvel at the architecture. The palace itself seemed alive, its walls pulsating softly with an inner light, almost as if it were breathing. It wasn't just stone and metal, it was something more, something organic. She glanced at Calith occasionally, trying to gauge the princess's mood, but the woman's expression remained unreadable, her silver armor reflecting the dim glow of the surroundings. Once inside, Leora was led to a chamber that served as both a prison and a guest room. Thick vines coiled around the doorframe, glowing faintly, ensuring she wouldn't be able to leave without permission. Caliph stood by the entrance, arms crossed, watching her silently. "You'll stay here until I decide what to do with you," Caliph said coldly before turning to leave. Leora sighed, sinking onto a surprisingly comfortable bench carved from luminescent crystal. "Guess this is better than being eaten by a dragon," she muttered to herself, running a hand through her hair. But despite her attempt at humor, she knew she couldn't relax. This place was dangerous, and Caliph clearly didn't trust her. She needed to find a way to change that. Fast. Over the next few days, Leora observed everything she could about the Zrinthians. From her window, she watched Caliph interact with Vrakshin, noting how the princess spoke to him in low tones, her usually stern demeanor softening slightly. There was a bond between them, one built on years of loyalty and mutual respect. It reminded Leora of her own connection to her ship, a partnership forged through shared struggles. One evening, unable to resist her curiosity, Leora ventured out onto the balcony overlooking the gardens. Below, Vrakshin lounged near a pool of water that shimmered like liquid starlight. He noticed her immediately, his golden eyes locking onto hers. Most people would have frozen in fear or retreated, but Leora did neither. Instead, she leaned against the railing, meeting his gaze calmly. "Hey there, big guy," she said quietly. "You're quite the sight." Vrakshin tilted his massive head, studying her intently. After a moment, he let out a low rumble, not aggressive, but curious. Encouraged, Leora reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of dried fruit she'd saved from her meals. Holding it out cautiously, she tossed it toward him. The morsel landed near his claws, and after a brief hesitation, Vrakshin sniffed it before eating it. A small smile tugged at Leora's lips. "See, not so bad, right?" Unbeknownst to her, Caliph had been watching the entire exchange from a nearby balcony. Her brow furrowed as she saw Vrakshin accept food from the human, a feat no one else had ever accomplished. Intrigued and irritated in equal measure, she descended to confront Leora. "What are you doing?" Caliph demanded, her voice sharp. Leora turned, startled but not afraid. "Just making friends," she replied evenly. "He seems lonely." Caliph bristled at the comment. "Vrakshin is not lonely. He has me." "Does he?" Leora countered, surprising even herself with her boldness. "Or does he have someone who expects him to follow orders without question?" For a moment, Caliph looked like she might strike Leora. But instead, she took a deep breath, composing herself. "You think you understand our bond because you fed him a scrap of food." "No," Leora admitted, "but I think understanding goes beyond words. If you don't believe me, test me. Let me prove it." Caliph hesitated, torn between anger and curiosity. Finally, she nodded curtly. "Very well. Prove your worth, human. Fail, and you'll face the consequences." As Caliph walked away, Leora felt a flicker of hope. For the first time since arriving on this alien world, she sensed an opportunity, not just to survive, but to truly connect. And maybe, just maybe, to earn Caliph's trust. Caliph wasted no time putting Leora's claim to the test. The very next morning, guards arrived at her chamber with orders to escort her to the training grounds. As they walked through the glowing halls of the palace, Leora couldn't help but notice the murmurs among the Zrinthians, some skeptical, others intrigued by the human who dared challenge their princess. She knew this was more than just a trial. It was a spectacle, and failure would mean humiliation, or worse. The first challenge took place in the labyrinthine gardens beneath the floating mountains. Towering crystalline walls twisted and turned, forming an intricate maze that seemed alive. Strange plants with venomous thorns lined the paths, while glowing insects darted around, their bites rumored to induce hallucinations. At the center of the labyrinth waited Vrakshin, his massive form barely visible through the shimmering foliage. "This is your first task," Caliph announced, standing at the entrance with arms crossed. Navigate the maze and reach Vraction without succumbing to its dangers. Fail, and you'll be left inside. Leora swallowed hard but nodded. Without hesitation, she stepped into the maze. The air grew thick and humid, muffling sound except for the faint rustle of leaves and distant growls. Her instincts kicked in as she moved cautiously, avoiding patches of ground where roots pulsed ominously. When a swarm of glowing insects descended upon her, she used her jacket to swat them away, holding her breath until they dispersed. After what felt like hours, she finally reached the center. Vraction stood there, watching her approach with an unreadable expression in his golden eyes. Leora stopped a few feet away, raising her hand slowly to show she meant no harm. To her relief, the dragon didn't attack. He merely let out a low rumble, acknowledging her presence. "You've done well," Calith admitted grudgingly when Leora emerged from the maze. But her tone made it clear the real challenges were yet to come. The second trial was far more dangerous. This time, Leora faced another dragon, a younger, wilder one named Cyrellus. Unlike Vraction, Cyrellus wasn't accustomed to humans and reacted with hostility the moment he saw her. His piercing shrieks echoed across the arena as he charged, claws extended. Leora's heart raced, but she forced herself to stay calm. Remembering how she'd approached Vraction, she spoke softly, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She crouched low, avoiding direct eye contact, and focused on projecting calmness rather than fear. It worked. After several tense moments, Cyrellus paused, tilting his head curiously. Encouraged, Leora held out her hand, letting him sniff her before stepping back respectfully. By the time the third trial arrived, whispers of Leora's success had spread throughout the palace. Dozens of Zrinthians gathered to watch as she prepared to ride Vraction across treacherous skies filled with electrical storms. Even Calith looked uneasy, though she tried to hide it behind her usual stern demeanor. "Are you ready?" Calith asked, handing Leora a harness designed for dragon riders. "As ready as I'll ever be," Leora replied, strapping herself in tightly. With a deep breath, she climbed onto Vraction's back, gripping the harness firmly as the dragon launched into the air. The flight was harrowing. Lightning crackled around them, illuminating the dark clouds, while fierce winds threatened to knock them off course. But Leora refused to panic. She leaned forward, speaking encouraging words to Vraction, trusting him completely. Together, they navigated the storm, emerging victorious on the other side. When they landed, the crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time, Calith allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps, she thought, this human was worth keeping around after all. The cheers from the crowd faded as Leora dismounted Vraction, her legs trembling slightly from the adrenaline rush. She glanced at Calith, expecting some kind of acknowledgement, or at least a nod of approval. But the princess simply turned and gestured for her to follow. The sharp contrast between the public spectacle and Calith's private demeanor left Leora puzzled. Was this woman truly impressed, or was she just playing along for the sake of appearances? They walked in silence through the glowing corridors of the palace until they reached a secluded chamber deep within the structure. Unlike the opulent halls above, this room felt intimate and ancient. Its walls were covered in intricate carvings that seemed to shift under the light, depicting dragons intertwined with humanoid figures. At the center stood a pedestal holding an orb that pulsed faintly, casting soft waves of color across the ceiling. "This is the heart of Zrinthia," Calith said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice carried a weight Leora hadn't heard before, reverence mixed with sorrow. "It is said to hold the essence of our world, binding us to the dragons." Leora approached cautiously, studying the orb with fascination. "So, the dragons aren't just animals. They're connected to this planet somehow." Calith nodded. "Long ago, our ancestors formed a pact with the dragons. We protect them, and in return, they share their power with us. But it's more than just strength, it's unity. Without them, we are nothing." For a moment, Leora didn't respond. She thought about how Vrakshin had responded to her, not out of fear or dominance, but trust. It made sense now. These creatures weren't mere beasts. They were sentient beings tied to something far greater than herself. As if reading her thoughts, Calith added, "Vrakshin trusted you almost immediately. That doesn't happen often." "Why me?" Leora asked softly, turning to face the princess. "I'm just a pilot who crashed on your planet. What makes me so special?" Calith hesitated, her gaze dropping briefly to the floor before meeting Leora's eyes again. "Perhaps because you see things differently. You don't approach him as a tool or a weapon. You treat him like an equal." Before Leora could respond, alarms blared throughout the palace, startling them both. Guards rushed past the doorway, shouting orders in a language Leora couldn't understand. Calith cursed under her breath, grabbing her spear and heading toward the commotion with swift strides. Leora followed close behind, curiosity overriding caution. In the main hall, chaos reigned. A group of rebels clad in dark armor had infiltrated the palace, led by none other than one of Calith's advisors, a tall man named Thalric, whose silver hair betrayed his otherwise youthful appearance. His betrayal cut deep, evident in the shock etched across Calith's face. "You would turn against your own people?" Calith demanded, her voice cold with fury. Thalric smirked, raising his weapon. "Your obsession with tradition has weakened us, Princess. It's time for change, and I'll make sure it happens." Before anyone could react, Thalric lunged at Calith. Instinctively, Leora stepped forward, shoving the princess out of harm's way. The blade grazed her arm, drawing blood, but she ignored the pain, focusing instead on creating distance between Calith and the attackers. When the dust settled moments later, reinforcements arrived, forcing the rebels to retreat. Breathing heavily, Calith stared at Leora, her expression unreadable. For the first time, there was no trace of hostility, only gratitude. "You saved my life," Calith said quietly. "I guess we're even now," Leora replied with a wry smile, clutching her injured arm. From that moment on, Calith began to see Leora not as an outsider, but as someone who might just belong in this strange, shimmering world after all. The aftermath of the attack left the palace in turmoil. Guards patrolled the halls more vigilantly than ever, their weapons drawn and their eyes sharp for any sign of further treachery. Calith spent long hours strategizing with her loyal advisors, trying to piece together how Thalric had managed to orchestrate such a brazen assault. Meanwhile, Leora found herself caught between gratitude and suspicion. Her actions had saved Calith's life, but whispers among the Zrinthians questioned whether she might be working with the rebels. It wasn't long before those whispers reached Calith's ears. One evening, as Leora tended to her injured arm in the guest chamber, guards stormed in without warning. They seized her roughly, ignoring her protests as they dragged her to the throne room. Calith stood there, her expression unreadable, her spear resting at her side. "Explain yourself," Calith demanded, her voice colder than Leora had ever heard it. "Why did you save me only to betray my trust?" Leora stared at her, stunned. "Betray you? What are you talking about?" Calith gestured sharply, and one of the guards stepped forward, holding up a crumpled piece of parchment. It was a forged letter, written in Leora's supposed handwriting, detailing plans to sabotage the palace defenses. Leora's stomach sank as she realized what was happening. Thalric had framed her. "This isn't mine," Leora said firmly, meeting Calith's gaze. "You know me better than this." But Calith hesitated, torn between logic and emotion. The weight of leadership pressed heavily on her shoulders, and doubt crept into her mind. Could she afford to trust someone who came from an alien world? A human, no less. "I gave you a chance, Leora," Calith said finally, her tone laced with regret. "If this is true." "It's not," Leora interrupted, her voice rising despite herself. "Ask Vrakshin. He knows I'm telling the truth." For a moment, silence filled the room. Then Calith turned to where Vrakshin waited nearby, his golden eyes watching the exchange intently. With a flicker of hope, Leora held her breath, praying the dragon would vouch for her. Vrakshin let out a low rumble, stepping closer until he towered over them all. His massive head dipped toward Caliph, nudging her gently before turning to glare at the guards surrounding Leora. The message was clear: harm her, and you'll answer to him. Caliph's jaw tightened. She dismissed the guards with a curt wave, ordering them to leave the chamber. Once they were alone, she turned back to Leora, her expression conflicted. Even if I believe you, others won't. You're too much of a risk. Before Leora could respond, the doors burst open again. This time, it was Thalric, flanked by his rebel forces. He smirked triumphantly, raising a strange device that emitted a high-pitched whine. Instantly, Vrakshin recoiled, letting out a pained roar as the sound overwhelmed him. "Take her away," Thalric ordered, pointing at Leora, "and make sure she doesn't escape." Panicked, Leora looked to Caliph for help, but the princess seemed frozen, overwhelmed by the sudden betrayal. Before the rebels could seize her, however, Vrakshin recovered just enough to lash out. His tail swept across the room, knocking several attackers off their feet. In the chaos, Leora grabbed a discarded weapon and fired blindly, disabling the device, emitting the painful noise. Seizing the opportunity, Vrakshin broke free entirely, scooping Leora onto his back with surprising gentleness. As the rebels regrouped, Caliph shouted after them, her voice filled with fury. "You'll pay for this treachery, Thalric." With a powerful beat of his wings, Vrakshin launched into the sky, carrying Leora away from the palace and into the unknown wilderness below. As they soared through the clouds, Leora clung tightly to his scales, her heart racing. She glanced back at the floating mountains, now distant specks against the horizon. "She'll come for us," Leora whispered, half to herself. "She has to." Unbeknownst to her, Vrakshin's thoughts echoed hers. Through their growing bond, he shared fragmented images of the planet's history, visions of ancient battles, forgotten alliances, and a looming threat tied to Thalric's rebellion. Whatever lay ahead, one thing was certain: Leora's journey was far from over. The wilderness below the floating mountains was as breathtaking as it was treacherous. Vrakshin landed in a secluded clearing surrounded by towering crystal trees, their glowing branches casting soft light over the area. Leora slid off his back, her legs wobbling slightly from the adrenaline rush of their escape. She looked around, taking in the shimmering landscape and the eerie silence that hung in the air. "We can't stay here long," she muttered, more to herself than to Vrakshin. "Thalric will send search parties." Vrakshin let out a low rumble, nudging her gently with his massive snout. It was clear he understood her concern, and shared it. The dragon's golden eyes glowed faintly as he lowered his head, almost inviting her closer. Hesitant but curious, Leora reached out, placing a hand on his warm scales. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Images flooded her mind, visions of the planet's past, its history intertwined with the dragons. She saw ancient civilizations thriving alongside these majestic creatures, united in harmony. But then came darker visions, wars fueled by greed, the corruption of leaders seeking power, and the creation of monstrous hybrids bred for destruction. At the center of it all stood Thalric, wielding forbidden knowledge to twist the natural order. Leora gasped, pulling her hand away. What was that?" Vrakshin tilted his head, letting out another rumble. Though she couldn't understand his words, the message was clear. The threat went beyond Thalric's rebellion. It endangered the entire planet. Determined to act, Leora ventured deeper into the forest with Vrakshin at her side. Along the way, they encountered rogue dragon riders who had abandoned Caliph's rule after losing faith in her leadership. At first, the riders were hostile, viewing Leora as an outsider unworthy of trust. But when Vrakshin roared in her defense, they hesitated, recognizing the bond between them. One of the riders, a young woman named Sira, stepped forward cautiously. "No one's ever earned Vrakshin's loyalty except Princess Caliph." "Who are you?" "I'm nobody special," Leora replied honestly. But I know Thauric's planning something bigger than just overthrowing Caliph. If we don't stop him, this world is doomed. Her sincerity struck a chord. Slowly, the riders began to listen, sharing stories of their own disillusionment with Caliph's rigid governance. Together, they formed an uneasy alliance, vowing to reclaim the palace and expose Thauric's schemes. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Caliph wrestled with guilt and anger. Her failure to protect Leora weighed heavily on her conscience, and whispers of doubt among her remaining loyalists only deepened her resolve. When scouts reported sightings of Leora leading a group of rebels, Caliph realized she had underestimated the human, and perhaps misjudged her entirely. The final confrontation unfolded atop the floating mountains, where Thauric unveiled his ultimate weapon, a grotesque hybrid dragon bred from stolen life force and dark magic. Its eyes burned with unnatural fire, and its roar shook the very foundations of the cliffs. As battle erupted, Leora rode Vrakshin directly into the fray, dodging blasts of energy and retaliating with precision strikes. The rogue riders fought valiantly alongside her, their dragons weaving through the chaos like living storms. Amidst the mayhem, Caliph joined the fight, her spear flashing as she confronted Thauric personally. "Your reign ends here," Caliph shouted, lunging at him. Thauric sneered, raising his weapon. "You're too late, princess. This world belongs to me now." But before he could strike, Leora intervened, using Vrakshin's agility to knock him off balance. Seizing the opportunity, Caliph disarmed him, pinning him to the ground. "You underestimated us both," Caliph said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain. With Thauric defeated and the hybrid dragon subdued thanks to Leora's quick thinking, the battle ended. Exhausted but victorious, Leora turned to Caliph, their shared triumph bridging the gap between them once and for all. The aftermath of the battle left the floating mountains scared but not broken. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky, mingling with the fading glow of the twin suns. The once pristine palace bore the marks of conflict, cracked walls, shattered bridges, and scorched gardens, but it still stood as a symbol of resilience. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, silence reigned over the cliffsides. Leora sat on a ledge overlooking the edge of the floating island, her feet dangling above the abyss below. Her body ached from the fight, and her injured arm throbbed painfully, but she barely noticed. Instead, her thoughts were consumed by everything that had happened: the trials, the betrayals, and the bonds she'd forged along the way. Beside her, Vrakshin lay sprawled across the ground, his massive form rising and falling rhythmically as he rested. Despite his size, there was something comforting about his presence. Caliph approached quietly, her armor dented and streaked with dirt from the battle. She paused for a moment, watching Leora before speaking. "You did well," she said simply, though her tone carried more warmth than usual. "Thanks to you, and Vrakshin," Leora replied, glancing at the dragon. "Without him, I wouldn't have made it this far." Caliph nodded, sitting down beside her. It was an unspoken gesture of trust, one that spoke volumes after all they'd been through. "You've earned my respect, Leora. Few humans, or Zrinthians, for that matter, could have done what you did." Leora smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone. You trusted me when it mattered most. That means something." For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply sat together, gazing out at the horizon, where the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of blooming plants from the gardens below. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos they'd endured just hours earlier. Finally, Caliph broke the silence. "What will you do now?" she asked, her voice softer than before. "Your ship is beyond repair, isn't it?" Leora sighed, leaning back on her hands. "Yeah, it's toast. But honestly, I'm not sure I want to leave, not yet anyway. There's so much about this world I don't understand, and I think I can help." Caliph raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Help how?" You're strong, Caliph, but even you can't shoulder everything alone, Leora explained. Your people need someone who sees things differently, someone who can bridge gaps instead of widening them. Maybe that person could be me. To her surprise, Caliph smiled. A genuine smile that softened her sharp features. Perhaps you're right. Perhaps we both have much to learn from each other. With that, Caliph extended a hand toward Leora. Welcome to Zrinthia, Captain Vance. Consider yourself an honorary citizen, if you'll accept. Grinning, Leora shook her hand firmly. I'd be honored. Over the following days, Leora worked alongside Caliph to rebuild trust among the Zrinthians. Together, they implemented reforms aimed at uniting the fractured factions, ensuring no one felt abandoned or betrayed again. The Rogue Riders returned to the palace, their loyalty renewed under a shared vision of unity. Even Vrakshin seemed content, his bond with Leora growing stronger every day. But despite finding a new home, Leora couldn't shake the feeling that her journey wasn't over. One evening, as she prepared to depart on a scouting mission with some of the riders, Caliph joined her near the launch site. Will you come back? Caliph asked, her tone laced with quiet vulnerability. Leora turned, meeting her gaze steadily. Of course. This place has become my home, and you're stuck with me now. As her ship ascended into the stars, Vrakshin let out a thunderous roar, echoing across the floating mountains. Below, Caliph watched the skies, a small smile tugging at her lips. For the first time in years, the future felt brighter and full of possibilities.